welcome to the third in our five-part series of nitrogen. Today's presentation, we're going to spend some time talking about Base Plus. You know, we at 360 Yield Center, we actually throw that phrase around a lot, Base Plus, and we thought, gosh, I wonder if we ever really dug into explaining what it is, why we use it, and what it means to use. So we just thought we'd spend a few minutes. This one probably won't take as long this morning, but just thought we'd spend a little time digging into what is Base Plus, how do you implement it, kind of the whys and whats. So here's what we're going to cover today. Why Base Plus? Why should we implement a Base Plus approach? What exactly it is when we talk about it? How do you execute it? Why do we start this new idea, this new concept of Base Plus? And truthfully, in a way, it's not new at all, right? There's many folks who have been doing it, but because of some new technologies as it relates to measuring and modeling and then application, it's probably moved to the forefront much more than in the past. And then we'll just spend a little time. There's some new data that's come in and look at some old data as well to just review, is it a legitimate concept? So let's get started. So I guess the first question we need to ask is why? Why should we even consider changing our nitrogen programs? And I'll start with these two slides. If you've seen any of my presentations before, you've seen these slides before. And I always ask this question. If you look at the guy on the left who's applying all his anhydrous in the fall, or the guy on the right who's finishing up his nitrogen application here at V3, the question, and by the way, I'm not necessarily saying these guys are wrong. They could be right, but the question is, could they have more information when they are finishing up their nitrogen application? Because here's a question I would like to ask both these growers is, what are your yields going to be? And if we're being honest, right, no one can really say at this point in time, certainly on the left, and even on the right, no one can say if we're going to have a great year, an average year, a poor year. So the real reason that we want to encourage growers to think about a Base Plus system is it allows you to gather more information, to make more informed decisions, and it's not just nitrogen, by the way, it could be about other inputs, but allow you to gather more time, to gather more information to make decisions that can have a better financial impact on the farm. Because we don't know if it's going to be like the year like 2015, right? Let's say if we've got all our nitrogen on, you know this, right? If we put all our nitrogen on, we have a year where we have high loss. We've just pumped a bunch of nitrates into the groundwater, and we've lost a lot of dollars that we didn't need to lose. Or, heaven forbid, we have a year like we did in 2012 on the right. If you put on 220 pounds of anhydrous in the fall, all right, and you're going to get 80 to 90 bushel corn, and again, heaven forbid that should happen, but the reality is it does happen. We do have years when we don't have fantastic yield. Is it a wise choice to make all our decisions about the crop in the fall or at V3? And that's really why, and I'll even back up, and one of the reasons we've, again, moved to this direction is we now have the ability to start measuring and modeling and applying nitrogen in a way that does allow us to change our practices to start adapting to some of these situations. So that's why, really, we want to start figuring out a way to split apply, to make decisions, to read the cards that Mother Nature's playing, and then start making better decisions. You all have seen this 100 times, right? This is the weather graph from Iowa State Climatology. And again, here's the main point. Years are different. They vary. So why would you, if you think about, and again, I apologize, you know, if you're a fellow who goes and puts 220 pounds on in the fall every year, but my question is, if every year is different, why would you use the same practice every year, knowing that when you look at the weather trends, they're all different? Doesn't it make more sense to adjust our method of application, our amount of application, our timing of application to best suit the growing season in which we are living? And that's really what we're talking about when we think about Base Plus as it relates to nitrogen. Let's start looking at these years as individual events and treating them that way, as opposed to just doing one thing the same every year. Let's start reacting to the years and making better decisions that will save us money. So I don't know if I've used this before. I always like to draw this up on a flip chart, But for lack of a better term, I call this time versus error. And if you look at this graph, I've got planting on the left and harvest on the right. And let's start with the red. Let's say that's our normal practice, and this is a growing season. So we have our decision point over on the left, and let's say, if you think about it, if you put all your nitrogen on in the fall, that's way over to the left further. But the further you get away from your decision point, things change, so your margin for error grows, right? That's why the further you get out, your error margin will grow over time. But let's say you go with a base plus decision point, right? You can have a base of nitrogen applied in the spring or the fall, and we'll talk about that. And then you make your final decision later on in the growing season. So using the same slope of two lines, what you'll find though is that your margin for error using a base plus system is smaller because you've gathered more information, right? You have, over that time, right, you will have a much better idea of loss of nitrogen, heavy rainfall events, whether it's dry. So the whole point of base plus is, and again, we'll talk about this more in a second, is to give you time to gather information, to make better decisions, to reduce the error margin in your decision-making process. It doesn't mean you'll eliminate it, right? We can still be wrong, or things can change after we do that final application, but it reduces the margin for error because we've gathered more information. And that's really, to me, that's one of the key messages about base plus, gathering more information and reducing the margin for error in our decision process. Again, same slide, but our decisions are going to be very, very different if we have a 2015 year or a 2012 year. So why not wait to gather that information to help us make those decisions? That's really what we're trying to talk about. So this is kind of a graphic to help demonstrate what is base plus, right? It is the application of and I'll use this phrase, let's say a suitable base rate of nitrogen. We'll talk about that, including a margin of safety. Then coming in, before we really hit that rapid growth phase, measuring, maybe it's modeling, measuring and modeling. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then making some final applications to feed that crop in season, putting the nitrogen when it needs it, where it needs it, to be the most effective, as opposed to, again, making all our decisions way over on the left-hand side, not knowing whether it's going to be 2015 or 2012 or 2016, where we have a fantastic year in many places. We need to supplement for higher yields. So that's really the point, right? Apply a base rate, have some safety margin, come in and measure, understand what kind of growing season we're having, and then making some final applications to finish that crop off. That's what the base plus system is. So I guess there's a lot of questions you'll get. The first one is, will it be the same base rate for everybody? When Jim Schwartz or Greg Sauter says, hey, I need a base rate, will it be the same for everyone? No, absolutely not. That will vary. We'll talk about all these in a minute. Will it be the same form of nitrogen for everybody? The answer to that is no, because we're not talking necessarily about you have to use this form of nitrogen versus that form. You have to use this rate because it will change. Will it be the same method of application for everyone? Answer again is no, because there is no one-size-fits-all approach as it relates to nitrogen. Never has been, never will be. That's not what base plus is. Base plus is not, you have to put your nitrogen on at this rate using this form at this time. No. Base plus is applying a base of nitrogen in a myriad of forms, rates, and times and methods to fit the operation that you're talking to or your operation. But it's not, what I don't want people to think is that this is a one-size-fits-all approach. It is not, far from it. So let's dig into these different questions a little bit more. What are some of these answers? Well, what's the right rate? Well, what's your drainage, right? If you have a poorly drained heavy clay soil, that's probably going to be different than a well-drained soil. What is your soil type? Again, do you have a prairie soil? And actually, I'm going to talk out of both sides of my mouth here in just a minute. But we'll talk about your soil type. That will determine how much you should put on. Do you feel like you can get mineralization? Do you have really good drainage where you're not concerned about denitrification or leaching? What form will you use? If you're going to use all liquid 28, all right, you may have to think differently about it versus whether or not you're going to use anhydrous or ammonium sulfate. And if you do, are you going to stabilize? Because all those decisions will affect the rate. And again, I want you to understand there is no right rate, right? I'm not going to sit here and tell you 100 pounds is the right number. I'll make some suggestions, but that can be completely wrong. I was talking to a grower 2 days ago, and we were reviewing some different scenarios for what his base rate should be. And I gave him a range, but I said, depending on if you do this, the number might be this. If you do this, the number might be that. So I guess the one thing I want to make sure everybody understands, at least from our perspective, or my perspective, is there's no one rate for every grower because a lot of things will impact that rate. If I had, and here's where I'm actually going to talk out of both sides of my mouth a little bit. If I had a soil like Greg does, okay, and I have very deep prairie, high organic matter soils, and I'm trying to decide what my base rate is going to be, I can look at it two ways. I will tell you, Greg's base rate, I'm pretty sure he applies about 110 pounds, and he does that because he says, I'm shooting for 300 bushel corn every year. I want to make sure I've got a good base rate, and I have margin for error if it starts raining and maybe my entry into the field is delayed. And so Greg is in that 100 to 110 pound range, and he's comfortable in that range. I could also make the argument, if I have this soil type, right, that I have better drainage, higher organic matter, likely higher mineralization. So the likelihood of loss to denitrification, probably leaching, and the likelihood of better mineralization is higher. So perhaps, depending on when I think I'm going to get in, on my labor pool, the capabilities of my team and my equipment, I could make the argument that maybe 75 to 80 pounds is enough if I feel like some of those other factors are in my hands, because I can mineralize more, I'm going to lose less. But Greg, he chooses to go with 110 pounds. I think that's the right number because he's shooting for higher yields and he feels really comfortable at that rate. Okay. Now let's go look at another soil type and discuss what might be the right rate. If you've ever been to eastern Indiana or Ohio, this is what they farm in a good chunk of the state. These are heavy, poorly drained clay soils. So now again, I will talk out of both sides of my mouth when I talk what's the right rate here. From one perspective, all right, the opportunity for me to denitrify my nitrogen, to lose it, is higher, okay? So I may want to have a little higher rate in these soil types in order to make sure I have a better margin of safety, right? I'm definitely in these soils, if I'm going to apply a base rate, I'm going to stabilize it to give me additional protection from denitrification, right? So I'm going to put a nitrification inhibitor in these soils, but I probably am going to have a little higher rate in these soils because I want a little higher margin for error depending on what happens to the weather. So in my opinion personally, now I'll just speak personally if I farm this, I would probably be putting on 100 or 105 pounds as a base rate on these heavier clay soils because I'm more concerned about loss. Now the flip side of that is if somebody wanted to make the argument and say, yes, but you're also going to lose it, so why would you put a higher rate down and expose it to loss? That's a fair argument. But in this case, right, I'm trying to protect my crop. I'm trying to make sure my corn never has a bad day. So I'm willing, that's a trade-off I'm willing to make. So here's the bottom line, okay? Whether it's this clay soil or that previous picture, some of those good prairie soils, I'm going to tell you 60 to 5 is a bare minimum, and we'll talk about the how, what forms and all that stuff and the placement. But I'm really comfortable, like in Greg's, at 80 to 85 as a minimum, up to 100 to 110 pounds. Somewhere in that range is probably going to be an appropriate base rate because I feel like that will get us through with a margin of error for safety to feed our crop that second time. Okay, I'm probably not necessarily real comfortable below 70 pounds, 65, 70 pounds. Because we can get caught. And I will tell you, I've seen data, right? I've seen it from the University of Illinois, where when it has a bad day, we're going to hurt the potential of our crop early on. We don't want to do that. So we want to make sure we have enough nitrogen there. So soil type, drainage, they will impact the rate, and you can make arguments either way, but you just want to make sure you have plenty there so that we don't have a bad day. So that's actually, I've kind of answered that. It's just different, right? So there is no one answer, and I hope no one ever says there's a definite, this is the right number, because there's not. And you all have heard me say this before, right? Every nitrogen decision I make can be 100% right or 100% wrong, depending on what happens after that decision point. You don't know. You just have to make the best decision with the information at hand. So I will tell you, you can go on. Yeah, I can tell you that there are years when I can put on 60 pounds of planting, and that's plenty. And there's years where I can put on 160, and that's probably not enough, right? So, okay, so how do I apply a base rate? What's the right way to do it? The answer is there is no right way, right? If a grower says to me he wants to put on anhydrous in the fall, I have no problem with that. My problem comes if he wants to put on all of it in the fall. But if he wants to apply a base rate in the fall and he wants to stabilize it, fantastic. That's a great way to do it. If he wants to put, if he wants to put some in a 2x2, 20 pounds in the 2x2, and he wants to come back with some weed and feed, and then at V3 add another 20 gallons, like that picture on the right, great. That's another good way to put on a base rate. I think go to the next slide. I think I've got another picture in there. If you want to spread ammonium sulfate, prior to plant, I've got no problem with that. Any of these methods as a base rate method. So one thing, again, I guess the point is I don't want folks to think that we're saying there is a best way to do it. There's all kinds of ways to skin this cat, okay? So you want to put on anhydrous? Great. You want to put on 28, you want to go with a 2x2 and a weed and feed, you want to put on ammonium sulfate? Fantastic. It's really not the method that drives the decisions. It's about splitting it up and using different methods. So all those methods are good, fine and acceptable. The point is, again, to make sure that we've got enough to get us to that safety margin before we can get in to start with our second and perhaps third. And hey, in some cases, there's guys that do more than that depending on the logistics of their operation. But to make sure we've got enough to get us to that point, because if you look over on the right-hand side, that's the percent uptake, right? So if you go to V10 and draw out to the right, at V10, that corn plant's only taken up about 25% of its total nitrogen. Now, it is, once it hits that, we're hitting that rapid uptake phase. We're talking 7 to 10 pounds of uptake per day. So we want to make sure we've got it there. We want to make sure we have it in the right form, right? We talked about in the other two webinars that the plant takes up the majority of its nitrogen in the nitrate form. So we want to make sure that we've got plenty of mobile nitrate now at this V10 stage for that corn plant to take up. But just make sure you've got enough to get us there, and then let's put the fuel in the race car and get it going. So the next question then is, I've applied my base rate, I've applied it, and it's different, and I've applied it in different forms, right? Could be anhydrous, whatever. Then the next question is, how do I decide my in-season rate? Well, there's a couple things we have to decide. And again, I will tell you, right, every decision could be right or wrong depending on what happens. Having said that, that's the beauty of our system, is it allows you to come back and adjust in season multiple times if necessary to account for changes in the environment. You can use a soil scan machine, right? That's a great way to measure. If you want to use like a Green Seeker, an OptRx, I'm not here to tell you that that's a wrong decision. If you want to use Air Scout and you want to use ADVI or NDVI imagery to help you make those decisions, if you want to use a crop model, like the crop model on the right, that's a nitrogen crop model, look, all these things are good tools that allow you to have more layers of information to make the right decision. Nitrogen is a slippery pig, right? And it is hard to grasp. And the more information you can have, the better the fidelity of the decision you'll make. So I'm not here to tell you there's one way to gather information to make those decisions. Use all of them. Use multiple layers of information to help you. If you like ADVI imagery through Air Scout, use it. If you like a crop model, these crop models continue to improve and get better and better and better. Use that. If you like using your soil scan machine as a way to ground truth some of this stuff, by all means use it. If you want to use OptRx, GreenSeeker, some of that technology, use it. But the point is, use these different tools that are coming on the market to gather this information, so that now that we're in season, we can say, okay, looks like I'm in a good spot. I'm going to supplement. It looks like this is going to be a good year. So I'm going to supplement with X amount, right? And adjust and react in the season. Or you can say, man, looks like I've lost a lot. We've had heavy rain, going to need to up it. Or you can be like 2016 and go, hokey smokes, I've had incredible mineralization. I think I can trim my rates back and not sacrifice yield this year. And that's the beauty of all this different information. Think about that decision error matrix I showed up. It just, the margin for error drops because you're gathering more and more of this information. Again, I sound like a politician probably waffling here, but there's no, I said there's no right rate. There's no right way of making the application, that base plus application. And there's no necessarily one way to gather this information for what your in-season rate should be. The more information you can gather, the better. So use the technologies available to us, layer that information to help make that decision. I will say, to no surprise to you all, that I do think the best way to come in and supplement once we do make that decision is with a Y drop. And we'll talk about that in a minute, but you will see data even this year where the benefits of placing the nitrogen next to the stock, we know it enough now to know that it is a really good way to supplement. Can you one of the questions I get a lot is, well, can I spread urea? You can, but is that, think about spreading urea in this field, is that as efficient as laying it right next to the stock? Probably not, right? Actually not. So once we get into our in-season decisions, I will say I do think that the Y-drop system is the best way to make those follow-up nitrogen applications, and sulfur, and maybe boron. So yeah, this is the way you want to come back and start supplementing in season. So why should a grower try it, right? Hey, it works. His old systems have worked for him. Why should we encourage guys to try it? And there will be growers that will tell you, I guarantee you there will be growers that will tell you this year, I didn't see any difference between applying it in season and applying it all up front. And I wouldn't doubt him, right, because of all the mineralization we've had. But there's two reasons, right? There's two reasons. Number one is economic, and number two is the environmental impact. And like it or not, that picture on the right, that's the world we live in today. Okay, I've attended a number of winter meetings, and I will tell you about 30% of those winter meetings deal with topics around environment. So if you think about the economics of it, right, if we can improve our NUE, if we can grow our yields with the same or less nitrogen, that's more dollars in your pocket. Or if you think again about putting 220 pounds on in a 2012, if we can not spend money that we don't need to, that's a good day. The other reason why a grower should try Base Plus is we've got to keep nitrates, phosphorus, things like that out of our groundwater, and that's really important to start thinking along those lines. And I will tell you that as growers, you will be rewarded for making the right decisions long term to do things that keep fertility out of streams and waterways in the U.S. Just the world we live in. So that's why they should try it. So I've got a few more slides and then really we'll be done. But some of you may have seen these before, but does it work? And we've got dozens and dozens of slides, but just want to show you a few here. Here's a great example. This is last year. When I say last year, this is 2015, where all the grower did, he took the same rate and he just split it, right? And let's go to the next slide and show the data from these different strips on this farm. Right, you can see that the grower, for the most part, there was one strip actually where it was different. Doesn't surprise me. That would be strip number 3. But using the same rate by splitting it up in a year where we had pretty heavy rainfall event, and this makes sense, right? It just makes sense. We got more yield with the same amount of nitrogen, and that's really what we're trying to do. That's that picture on the left when I showed you before, the economics, and it's actually the picture on the right because we're keeping it out of the groundwater and getting it into the crop, okay? Again, many of you have seen this. This was 2015 where a grower split a field. He used less nitrogen. Okay, what they'd done on the farm forever was 200 pounds of V3 of anhydrous. Okay, and really our question is, this gets back to, you want to use anhydrous N3 as a base rate, go for it. But what if then we take the subsequent applications and split them up a little bit? What can we accomplish? So here's a grower, again, heavy rainfall year, right? Wasn't that heavy in this area, but it was still pretty heavy. And he gained a lot more grain with 15 pounds less nitrogen, and that's really what we're talking about. There's a couple slides here that really encapsulate what we're trying to get to with Base Plus, and this is one of those slides that really does that. Now, this is data from Greg's farm this year. If you come out to training or you're coming to training, you will see this, and I think it's a powerful slide. Different strips, right? This is 2016 data. We talk a lot about really high mineralization. That's one of the topics we address at the training, and here's a great illustration of that, right? These are different levels of nitrogen application and the associated yields. I mean, look at that. You can see 140 pounds, 165 pounds, 205 pounds, and 210 pounds. And look at the yields associated with it. So what if a grower is able to go out, right? And by the way, the reason Greg started doing these strips, I would tell you it was July. I started looking at plots with 0 nitrogen applied, and they look beautiful. And I remember we were having internal conversations about the levels of mineralization we were witnessing this year. We're like, holy mackerel, there's a lot of free N available. Hey Greg, well, instead of just finishing off your crop, let's start finding out. Let's start seeing how low we can go and push it to find out how much nitrogen we are mineralizing and how it might impact yield. So we started putting out trials on his farm, right, to measure it. And this is just one strip. Now, and you can see, right, 140 pounds, that was plenty. And by the way, he was mineralizing in some of his fields 150 to 180 pounds of nitrogen this year, okay? Now, I would never, ever expect a grower to cut back his nitrogen rate 70 pounds in season, never. But what if he could trim it back 20 pounds and not sacrifice yield? Well, you know, $10 an acre on 1,000 acres is not chunk change. Those margins, that can be the profit on farms sometimes. So that's really what we're talking about, is just understanding the environment, understanding the art of nitrogen, making some decisions to say, yep, I've got a great mineralization here. Maybe I can trim my rates back. And here's the thing, if you do this a few times, I'm not sitting here going, oh yeah, all your acres, 100% of them, cut back your rates 20 pounds. But maybe you can start doing this so that if you file that away in the memory bank and we have another year like 2016, maybe we can learn from it, and that helps give us information to make decisions in the future. Here's another trial this year where we put all the anhydrous at V5, and then we put anhydrous Y drop with V12. It was followed 60 pounds of even feed. Okay, it's just another example where if you look at the rates over on the right, you do the math, that's actually that red bar, it's less nitrogen, right, but more yield. And that's the beauty of the Base Plus system. I will tell you, it's interesting, maybe you've heard me say this before, I've had people in 2015 go, boy, what a great year for Y drop. And I'm like, yeah, it kind of is and it kind of isn't, because it also puts stress on systems of getting back in the field. Sometimes it wasn't always possible. To me, 2016 is a banner year for Y drop. It's a perfect year because it demonstrates the power of the Base Plus system of weighting, measuring, and making decisions that can save me money without hurting yield at all. And these last two slides are great examples of doing that. Here's another trial from this year. So kind of look at it as two sets of bars. Okay, the black and the red bar, that's Coulter at V8, 150 pounds, Y drop, V8, 150 pounds. Okay, and you can see there's a difference there between a Coulter and a Y drop, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit in a minute. And then the bars on the right, I think, are really powerful. This is, again, another trial where we said, hey, we think we've got great mineralization. Let's trim it back just a tick. So we applied at V12 with a Y drop, 150 pounds, then we dropped to 25 pounds. There's no difference in those yield numbers. And again, it's the point we're trying to make. This is also a great year for Y drop because it allowed us to gain a better understanding when we have a high mineralization year. Those are some pretty decent yields, right? and he put on 125 pounds there in that trial in the side dress. Okay. Now, the two bars on the left, I do want to talk about that because one of the things, you can go to the next slide, is placement. There is a benefit to the placement. Earlier I said, you know, I don't care how you apply your base rate. I don't care the method or the form. I can tell you, as it relates to the in season, placement matters. This is a trial that Stephanie did on their farm, and basically they tied the hoses together because we get a lot of guys say, I'll just dribble it. All right, so we wanted to try that out. You can see there is certainly a difference, right, between the placement of the nitrogen next to the base of the plant versus in the middle of the row. Would you go back to that prior slide for me a second? If you look, that black bar and that red bar, Coulter versus wide drop, guess what? Interestingly enough, it's about the same number. It's about 5 bushel, right? We are seeing the benefit of placement, even in a year, right, where the secondary, third, fourth applications may not be driving great yield because of mineralization we had. We're still seeing the benefit of the placement next to the plant. Stole this from the Beck's PFR book, and the reason I did is it really is interesting. We saw this about the same number, right? The wide drop versus side dress applicator, basically it's kind of a Coulter system, right? About a 5.5 bushel difference this year in those fields. So even in years where we had a lot of mineralization, where supplemental applications probably didn't have to have as much nitrogen involved, we are still seeing the benefit of the placement of the nitrogen next to the row. So I think that was my last slide. That's my last slide. So here's the take home, I guess. As we think about why Base Plus, we're trying to improve our efficiency. We're trying to save dollars, right? And by the way, not every year can we save dollars. Last year, 2015, we had to save our output, right, our yields, by adding more dollars because we lost so much. But in a year like this, we can save a lot of dollars. We can save money on the input, right, because we had such great mineralization, and we can still increase yield simply from the placement of the nitrogen. But Base Plus can be a number of different methods. It can be a number of different forms. I've had conversations with growers, and they're like, well, are you telling me I shouldn't use anhydrous at V3? No. But I am telling you, I don't think you need to have all your nitrogen on early in order to make those final decisions. So, all right, well, thanks, everybody. Appreciate it very much. Have a great day. We will be talking to you later.